In the shadows of history lie sealed corridors, places where the light of truth has never reached. Files marked for destruction, operations erased from ledgers, whispers of weapons and men who were never meant to exist. These are not the battles, carved into monuments, but the silences buried beneath them. Step carefully. Each uncovered page hints at a darker war fought in the margins, where secrets are preserved not to protect nations, but to conceal what they became. In the early spring of 1941, British and Commonwealth forces found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered on the Greek mainland. Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht had launched Operation Marita on April 6, sending the 12th Army surging through Bulgaria into Macedonia and Thessaly. Despite fierce resistance by Australian and New Zealand units, German panzers forced a rapid Allied withdrawal. Churchill, unwilling to abandon Greece entirely, ordered a large-scale evacuation to Crete and Egypt under the codename Operation LUSTRE. Between April 24th and April 29th, Royal Navy destroyers, cruisers, and requisitioned transports made repeated crossings, removing tens of thousands of men. But in the surviving records of that retreat, there remains one anomaly: the fate of Convoy AN-14. Official British war diaries describe Convoy AN-14 as a small transport flotilla, departing from the port of Volos under cover of darkness. On April 25th, it reportedly consisted of 3 requisitioned Greek steamers, SS Thalia, SS Kyriaki, and SS Ithaki, escorted by HMS Havoc and HMS Hereward, both Royal Navy destroyers. Their destination was the Cretan harbour of Suda Bay. According to Admiralty signals, the convoy was last in radio contact at 23:40 that night, reporting calm seas and limited Luftwaffe reconnaissance overhead. Within hours, however, it vanished from the Allied record. The official explanation, circulated in a post-action summary by the Mediterranean Fleet on May 3, 1941, was that the convoy had been intercepted by enemy air attack. Luftwaffe bombers based at Athens Tatoi and the island of Rhodes were blamed for sinking the transports with heavy loss of life. Yet, curiously, no German aerial combat reports for April 25 to 26 mention such an engagement. The logbook of Kampfgeschwader 77, the Luftwaffe bomber wing responsible for strikes in the Aegean, makes no reference to convoy targets in the Volos-Crete sector during those days. RAF Ultra decrypts captured at Bletchley Park likewise contain no indications of a Luftwaffe sortie against Allied shipping in that time frame. For decades, the incident passed with little scrutiny until fragments of declassified naval traffic began to surface in the early 1990s. Among these fragments was a British Admiralty signals log from Alexandria, dated April 26, 0115, referencing a lost station call from HMS Havoc, presumed torpedoed. The message was immediately classified most secret and attached to a file marked AN-14 Special Interest. A marginal note, written in pencil and initialed by Rear Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple, commander of the 7th Cruiser Squadron, reads, "Italians involved. Capture possible. Review POW lists." This was unusual. Pridham Whipple's squadron had suffered heavily in the evacuation, yet his specific concern about capture implied intelligence personnel or sensitive cargo were aboard. Italian naval records, long concealed, add further intrigue. When the archives of the Regia Marina were opened briefly after 1990, researchers discovered references to EMAS torpedo boats operating under the command of Capitano di Corvetta Guido Conti. A patrol log dated April 26, 0220 describes contact with 3 enemy transports east of Skyathos, escorted by 2 destroyers. The log continues. First salvo struck leading transport. Illumination revealed panic aboard. Destroyers engaged with light weapons. Boarding attempt ordered. The entry ends abruptly, followed by several blank pages marked Censored, Officio Segreto. No further mention of this encounter exists in Italian files. Theories surrounding the fate of Convoy AN-14 often focus on the identities of its passengers. The War Office evacuation lists released in 1946 make no mention of The soldiers supposedly aboard the Thalia, Kyriaki, or Ithaki, unlike other lost ships, such as the Ulster Prince or Slamet, no official casualty rolls were ever compiled. Instead, the missing appear to have been quietly omitted from regimental histories. Yet, a handful of post-war testimonies suggest otherwise. In 1957, a former prisoner of war named Sergeant James Whitmore of the 6th Australian Division claimed that while interned at Stalag 8B in Silesia, he met a group of New Zealand officers who said they were captured at sea near Skiathos. When Whitmore tried to report this to the Australian War Graves Commission, the testimony was dismissed as confusion. More damning evidence appeared in 1992 when Russian researchers working in the Central Archives of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk uncovered a Soviet intelligence summary dated June 1941. The NKVD report referenced a transport of English specialists seized by Italians near Larissa sector, now being transferred through Trieste to Silesian camps. The word specialists was often NKVD shorthand for intelligence officers. This matches an uncatalogued British Cabinet Office memorandum from 1947, later released under the 30-year rule, which warned of embarrassing questions regarding LUSTRE convoys and missing personnel engaged in signals work, if indeed Convoy AN-14 carried not ordinary infantry, but intelligence staff, possibly members of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, operating in Greece. Its erasure from official records begins to make sense. The SOE had been attempting to organize resistance cells in Thessaly and Macedonia in early 1941, relying on wireless operators and linguists. Their capture would have compromised codes, local contacts, and the broader Allied intelligence structure in the Balkans. A cover story of air attack may have been preferable to admitting an entire cadre of trained operatives had fallen into enemy hands. The Royal Navy destroyers supposedly escorting the convoy also present inconsistencies. HMS Havoc did not appear in any official casualty lists for April 1941, yet her own logbook for April 25 is missing. HMS Hereward's records survive, but curiously omit all entries between 20 am and 05 am that night. Naval historians reviewing the file in 1963 noted that pages were torn out. Both vessels later saw action in the Mediterranean, yet references to their participation in Convoy AN-14 ceased entirely after the war. To this day, no wrecks corresponding to the Thalia, Kyriaki, or Ithaki have been found in the Aegean. Modern Greek diving expeditions in the Sporades and northern Cyclades turned up nothing. Italian researchers claim that after 1943, when Italy switched sides, their archives were deliberately purged of sensitive naval operations connected to prisoner transfers. What remains is a shadowy absence. 3 transports, 2 destroyers, log entries, hundreds of missing men, and a trail of contradictory reports. The disappearance of Convoy AN-14 stands as one of the least understood incidents of the Greek campaign. Whether its ships were sunk, captured, or quietly redirected remains unresolved. What can be said with some confidence is that the official version of a Luftwaffe air raid sinking transports in open water was almost certainly false. Instead, evidence points toward interception by Italian naval forces, capture of Allied personnel, and the deliberate erasure of their fate from wartime records. For those who vanished that night in the Aegean, there are no graves, only silence preserved. In classified files and missing logbooks, the Mediterranean swallowed their ships, but governments buried the truth. In the final months of the Second World War, Allied forces swept through collapsing Germany, uncovering laboratories, test sites, and command centers filled with weapons that seemed decades ahead of their time. Some were crude prototypes, others, little more than paper designs, but among the most startling finds was a radar plotting system hidden deep within the ruins of Berlin. The machine, designated in surviving records as Project SEEBURG, would become one of the most contested pieces of technology in post-war intelligence circles. An apparatus capable of blending human operators with electronic computation to direct air defense in real time. Its existence was almost entirely erased from public accounts, resurfacing only through fragments of declassified files and testimony from surviving Luftnachrichten, air signals, personnel. The origins of SEEBURG date back to 1941, when German air defense struggled to respond effectively to RAF nighttime bombing raids. The Luftwaffe's Kammhuber line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, had attempted to coordinate flak and night fighters through rigid defensive zones, but the RAF's adoption of bomber stream tactics soon overwhelmed these fixed systems. In response, German engineers began experimenting with centralized command tables that could collate radar returns and relay fighter vectors more quickly. The SEEBURG apparatus, named after the town where some components were first tested, combined two critical technologies: the Würzburg-Riese radar, which tracked aircraft with remarkable accuracy, and a massive illuminated plotting table on which operators could manually tag both enemy and friendly aircraft. Allied intelligence first suspected its existence in 1943, when photo reconnaissance over Holland revealed unusual structures near Dielen Air Base, codenamed Himmelbett bunkers. Decrypted Luftwaffe signals intercepted at Bletchley Park also referred to SEEBURG Tische, literally SEEBURG tables. The meaning remained unclear until April 1945, when the US 83rd Infantry Division seized a bunker complex outside Berlin and reported finding a radar control room with advanced computing-like circuits. An OSS field report dated April 28th described large glass plotting surfaces, electronic relays unlike any Allied equipment, and evidence of semi-automated tracking. The apparatus was dismantled and transferred to Wright Field in Ohio, where it vanished into the growing labyrinth of captured German technology programs. What made SEEBURG remarkable was not merely its plotting capability, but its integration with flak and night fighter guidance. Surviving Luftnachrichten officers, interrogated at CSDIC camps in 1946, described experimental trials in which radar echoes were manipulated to create phantom formations, drawing RAF bombers off course into heavily defended sectors. One technician, Oberfeldwebel Dieter Kranz, told interrogators that in January 1945, the SEEBURG system was linked to automatic searchlight controls in Berlin, creating sudden corridors of illumination that trapped bombers in concentrated flak fire. Allied bomber crews did indeed report such experiences, paths that seemed unnaturally predictable, zones where every evasive maneuver met a wall of searchlights. At the time, these were blamed on improved German coordination, but the SEEBURG testimony suggested deliberate radar deception. Yet, when historians sought evidence after the war, almost nothing remained. The official German air defense files captured by the Allies contained references to SEEBURG only in passing, with many pages stamped "Removed by Schaff, 1945." Technical drawings known to exist in the Merkers salt mine, where US forces uncovered vast caches of looted materials, were not among the documents later released. Instead, brief descriptions appeared in an internal US Army Air Forces document, Evaluation of Enemy Radar Devices, circulated in 1946 but classified top secret until the late 1970s. In it, SEEBURG was described as a semi-automated, fire control plotting system, potentially applicable to guided missile interception. Soviet sources provide a parallel thread. When the Red Army captured Luftwaffe headquarters at Werder near Potsdam, they reportedly seized several components of a SEEBURG table, including cathode ray tubes used for plotting radar echoes. A declassified GRU report from 1952 claimed these devices were integrated into the S-25 Berkut, Moscow's first guided missile air defense network. Former Soviet engineers, interviewed after 1991, insisted that SEEBURG influenced early Soviet attempts at semi-automated radar plotting, though they admitted much of the documentation had been lost or hidden during the purges. The secrecy surrounding SEEBURG in the West appears tied to its incorporation into American Cold War research. Operation Paperclip had already transferred hundreds of German engineers, including specialists in radar and electronics, to the United States. Among them was Dr. Hans Plendl, formerly chief of the Luftwaffe's radar program, who later worked with the US Air Force on long-range guidance systems. Though Plendl never spoke publicly about SEEBURG, FBI files released in 2005 contain references to examination of the SEEBURG plotting device by Plendl and associated team at Wright Field, 1946. By the 1950s, the US had begun deploying SAGE, semi-automatic ground environment, a vast radar-based air defense system that bore striking conceptual similarities. Large illuminated plotting displays, integration of radar feeds, and semi-automated vectoring of interceptors. Official histories of SAGE make no mention of German influence, yet the chronological overlap is difficult to ignore. First-hand testimony is scarce but consistent. In 1961, a British radar officer named Group Captain George Lawson published an article in an obscure journal, Aviation Quarterly, in which he described visiting Berlin in July 1945 and seeing an immense glass plotting table, like a giant, illuminated map, with red and blue traces dancing across its surface. The article was swiftly withdrawn from circulation, reportedly at the request of the Ministry of Defense. Lawson's personal papers, released by his family after his death in 1988, confirm his belief that SEEBURG represented the first true step toward computer-assisted air defense. The darker implications, however, are less technical than ethical. Documents held in the Bundesarchiv suggest that SEEBURG was tested in 1944, not only against bombers, but against civilian targets. A Luftgaukommando Berlin report, dated February 3, 1945, records the use of special SEEBURG guidance during the defense against a massive raid, during which entire bomber streams were steered inadvertently over densely populated neighborhoods, ensuring maximum destruction when bombs were jettisoned. Whether this was deliberate targeting or simply the consequence of directing attackers into flak zones remains unclear, but it demonstrates the system's potential for manipulation on a scale beyond conventional warfare. By the 1970s, most physical evidence of SEEBURG had vanished. The bunkers at Dielen were stripped, the Berlin control rooms demolished, and the Wright Field prototypes never surfaced in US archives. Yet fragments of testimony and scattered reports continue to raise unsettling questions. How much of Cold War air defense, both American and Soviet, rested on technology quietly expropriated from a collapsing Reich? And why has SEEBURG, unlike jet propulsion or V-weapons, been almost completely erased from the public story of wartime technology? Today, only a handful of grainy photographs remain, showing shadowed figures leaning over a glowing glass table, marked with red and blue lines. No surviving hardware is known, but in those faint images lies the outline of a machine that bridged the gap between the analog war of the 1940s and the computerized conflicts of the Cold War. The SEEBURG table was more than just a plotting device. It was an early glimpse of a future where war would be guided not only by men, but by machines interpreting signals in real time. A future born in the chaos of Berlin, buried in Allied archives, and forgotten by official history. The Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, known to Allied commanders during the Second World War as Spitsbergen, was both strategically insignificant and strangely vital. Lying midway between Norway and the North Pole, its coal mines and weather stations offered Germany a foothold for monitoring the North Atlantic. Weather reports from Svalbard were indispensable for planning U-boat patrols and Luftwaffe operations over the Arctic convoys bound for Murmansk. For the Allies, denying Germany this capability became an urgent though little publicized priority. The official story tells of Operation Freetham, a disastrous Anglo-Norwegian raid in May 1942 that ended when the raiding party was caught and decimated by Luftwaffe bombers. Yet in the years since, fragments of naval logs, oral testimonies, and Norwegian coastal records have suggested that the tragedy concealed something darker. The extraction, disappearance, and possible silencing of prisoners never acknowledged. In the official record, Operation Freetham was launched from Greenock, Scotland, in late April 1942, under the command of Norwegian Major Einar Sverdrup. Its purpose was straightforward on paper: land a force of free Norwegian troops on Spitsbergen to destroy German weather stations, secure the coal mines, and hold the settlements until further reinforcement. The men sailed aboard 2 coal transport ships, Isbjørn and Celis, both old trawlers poorly suited for Arctic warfare. They carried only light armament and depended on secrecy for survival. On May 14th, the vessels reached Adventfjorden, near the mining town of Longyearbyen. Within hours, German reconnaissance aircraft from Tromsø located them. On May 15th, U-88 bombers of Kampfgruppe 30 attacked, sinking the Isbjørn and setting the Sellis ablaze. Survivors scrambled ashore, many suffering burns or frostbite. The raid, officially declared a failure due to air attack, was remembered only as a tragic setback. But classified reports buried in Royal Navy files suggest that Operation Fritham may not have been what it seemed. An uncatalogued Admiralty memorandum dated June 1942, unearthed in the UK National Archives during the 1980s, refers cryptically to cargo secured at Barentsburg. Barentsburg was the Soviet-operated mining settlement on Spitsbergen, largely abandoned during the war. The use of the term cargo raised eyebrows among researchers, as no known material shipments were scheduled. A marginal note, written by Vice Admiral Henry Hamilton, commander of the Home Fleet's Arctic section, adds, "Sensitive persons extracted, disposal unrecorded." The phrasing suggested human captives rather than supplies. Norwegian sources add to the mystery. In 1951, a former fisherman from Tromsø, Jens Lian, gave testimony to a local newspaper that during the spring of 1942, he saw strange men guarded by English sailors on the deck of an Allied trawler near Bjørnøya, Bear Island. He described them as wearing ragged clothing and speaking Russian. Lian's account was dismissed at the time as drunken embellishment, but his description aligns with Soviet reports uncovered decades later. In 1994, Russian historians working in the archives at Arkhangelsk discovered NKVD summaries from July 1942, noting the unexplained disappearance of Soviet citizens from Barentsburg, possibly transferred by British. Who were these missing men? One theory suggests they were Soviet defectors, prisoners of war captured by the Germans in 1941 and forced to man weather outposts under Wehrmacht supervision. Testimony from German naval meteorologists captured in 1945 confirms that Soviet laborers were sometimes compelled to work on Arctic stations, cutting coal and maintaining generators. If such prisoners were recovered during Operation Fritham, their presence would have been politically explosive. In 1942, Anglo-Soviet relations were fragile, revealing that British forces had intercepted and possibly detained Soviet nationals outside of Moscow's knowledge could have damaged the alliance. Better, perhaps, to quietly erase them from the record. Supporting this theory are anomalies in Royal Navy after-action reports. The surviving deck log of HMS Niger, which rendezvoused with the Fritham survivors in June, makes a passing reference to passengers transferred, identity withheld. Another line, subsequently struck through, reads, NKVD to handle. This suggests that some form of handover to Soviet security services may have been planned, yet there is no record of such a transfer ever occurring. No Soviet file mentions receiving captives from Spitsbergen in 1942. Instead, the trail vanishes. Curiously, Norwegian civilian fishing logs tell of armed patrols around an unnamed inlet west of Longyearbyen during 1946-1947, after the war's end. Several fishermen described being turned away by Allied personnel, despite the war being over and the islands supposedly under Norwegian sovereignty. One even recorded seeing barbed wire and guard posts in a bay not listed on any official maps. Whether this was connected to the missing prisoners or to post-war intelligence installations remains uncertain. Adding weight to suspicions is the discovery of a fragmentary RAF photographic reconnaissance report from 1945, catalogued under Air Ministry File AIR 40302. The images, taken over Spitsbergen in July 1945, show what appears to be a cluster of structures on the coast near Adventfjorden, including what looks like a fenced compound. The report's caption labels the site Temporary Allied Facility. No record exists of Allied operations in Svalbard that late in the war. The site was later abandoned and erased from maps. By the early Cold War, any mention of Fritham's prisoners had been buried. A 1958 British Cabinet Office memo on sensitive Arctic matters explicitly warned against discussing the Barentsburg question with NATO partners. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda repeatedly accused Britain of seizing and disappearing Soviet citizens during the war, though never in detail. These accusations were dismissed by Western officials as baseless, yet the classified files suggest they were not entirely unfounded. What became of the captives, if indeed they existed, is unknowable. Some historians speculate they were quietly handed over to Soviet intelligence under secret agreements, only to vanish into the Gulag system like countless others. Others believe the British retained them for interrogation, perhaps suspecting them of collaboration with the Germans. Still others suggest the prisoners never left Spitsbergen, that they were abandoned in some remote fjord, left to perish in silence. The official story of Operation Fritham remains unchanged. 2 ships destroyed, dozens of Norwegian soldiers killed, and survivors forced into hiding until relief arrived months later. But the deeper record tells of more: secured cargo, vanished Soviet prisoners, and hidden compounds in the Arctic wilderness. Whether these fragments reveal a botched intelligence mission, a failed attempt at prisoner exchange, or simply the fog of war is impossible to prove. What is certain is that in the frozen fjords of Spitsbergen, something happened that both London and Moscow preferred never to acknowledge. The Arctic has kept its secret well, locked in ice and silence, with only scattered documents and rumors hinting at the truth beneath the snow. In December 1944, the Western Front erupted with the last great German offensive of the Second World War, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German troops surged through the Ardennes in a desperate attempt to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. Amid the chaos, American units, cut off, encircled, and fighting in bitter winter conditions, recorded encounters with a German armored formation that has never been accounted for in official Wehrmacht orders of battle. Known in scattered reports as Kampfgruppe Eberswald, this so-called Ghost Division fought with a precision and ferocity that bewildered US commanders, then vanished into the forests of the Schnee-Eifel without leaving wrecks, prisoners, or even traces in German archives. For decades, its existence was dismissed as confusion in the fog of war. Yet newly surfaced documents and declassified signals intercepts suggest something far more deliberate: the testing of experimental weaponry under conditions engineered to ensure no survivors or witnesses. The first references to the mysterious unit appear in the after-action reports of the US 106th Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of the German attack in the Schnee-Eifel sector. On December 17, 1944, elements of the 422nd Infantry Regiment reported being struck by a column of Panther tanks bearing unfamiliar insignia, a black oak tree set against a white circle. Survivors claimed the tanks carried unusual infrared equipment. Mounted on their turrets, strange tubular devices described as black lamps. Infantry accompanying the tanks used automatic weapons with unnaturally precise night-firing capability. The US report, filed by Lieutenant Colonel William T. Jackson, noted, "These troops were not from any known SS or HERE formation. Tactics unorthodox. Unit designation unknown." His report was forwarded to 1st Army Headquarters, but marked "No action." Further sightings came 2 days later. On December 19th, patrols from the US 28th Infantry Division near Hosingen described being ambushed at night by armored vehicles, driving without visible headlights, yet maneuvering with uncanny accuracy. Again, the strange insignia was noted, along with odd hissing sound from some tanks, possibly experimental engines. Prisoners captured from surrounding SS units later denied knowledge of any such formation. In fact, some expressed confusion, claiming the insignia described by Americans did not correspond to any recognized Wehrmacht division. The mystery deepens when examined alongside Bletchley Park decrypts. Ultra-intercepts from December 1944 include several references to Wunderwaffen, Panzergruppe operating in the Ardennes. A fragmentary Enigma message from Army Group B headquarters, decrypted on January 3, 1945, contains the line, Einsatzgruppe Eberswald operational. Field test satisfactory. No further reports. The message was heavily redacted when released in 1979, but even in partial form, it suggests the existence of a unit conducting field tests rather than conventional combat. What precisely was being tested? Surviving German technical reports provide clues. In late 1944, the Waffenamt, Army Ordnance Office, was experimenting with Zielgerät 1229, an infrared aiming device nicknamed Vampir. Designed to be mounted on Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifles, it allowed limited night vision capability using active infrared illumination. Similarly, the Panzerkampfwagen Panther was tested with FG 1250 infrared searchlight systems, enabling night combat without visible light. Historians have long debated whether these devices ever saw frontline use. Officially, only small numbers were deployed in February 1945 on the Eastern Front. Yet, American accounts of December 1944, combined with the black lamps noted in field reports, hint that prototypes may have been tested in the Ardennes weeks earlier, under the cover of a supposedly non-existent division. The absence of captured personnel or wrecks has long puzzled researchers, but a close reading of 1945 Allied intelligence summaries provides a possible answer. A Scharf G2 report, dated February 7, 1945, notes unusual gaps in German withdrawal trail, Unit Eberswald unaccounted, suggest deliberate destruction of material to prevent intelligence exploitation. This aligns with testimony from a captured German signals officer, interrogated at Camp 020 in Britain, who claimed that special units were ordered never to leave equipment for the enemy. According to his account, prototypes tested in combat were to be either destroyed in situ or evacuated back to Germany at all costs. Still, scattered eyewitness accounts persisted long after the war. In 1953, a former officer of the US 9th Armored Division recalled a firefight near Clairvaux in which German troops seemed to see in the dark as if it were daylight. In 1968, Belgian villagers reported discovering skeletal remains of German soldiers in an unmarked mass grave near the Our River, their uniforms stripped of insignia. The site was later bulldozed during road construction. None of these fragments conclusively prove the existence of Kampfgruppe Eberswald, but together they form a disturbing mosaic. The Germans themselves left almost no trace. The massive post-war project of capturing Wehrmacht documents, some 15 million pages, contains not a single reference to a Panzergruppe or Kampfgruppe Eberswald. Military historians reviewing the files in the 1970s concluded the unit never existed. But declassified CIA documents from the early Cold War reveal that both American and Soviet intelligence quietly investigated rumors of phantom units deployed in 1944. A CIA memorandum from 1952, titled Unidentified Armored Formation, Ardennes, concluded. Reports likely refer to SS detachment testing night fighting apparatus, presence expunged from Wehrmacht records at high level. Soviet records from the GRU contain similar assessments, noting that Red Army units encountered infrared-equipped German rifles in Silesia in March 1945, months before their supposed official deployment. The political implications of acknowledging such a unit were considerable. Admitting that the Germans had tested advanced infrared technology in combat against American forces would have fueled controversy at a time when both Washington and Moscow were racing to exploit captured German science. Instead, the Ghost Division was allowed to fade into rumor, its existence denied in official histories, its traces buried beneath redacted files and missing reports. Today, the Ghost Division of the Ardennes survives only in scattered testimonies, inexplicable gaps in the archives, and the haunting consistency of American reports written in the heat of battle. Whether Kampfgruppe Eberswald was a fully formed panzer regiment, a temporary test detachment, or a fabrication born of chaos remains uncertain. But the convergence of evidence suggests something real, something experimental, dangerous, and deliberately erased. For the soldiers of the 106th and 28th Divisions, who faced them in the frozen forests of December 1944, the memory of tanks moving through the night without lights, of invisible enemy rifles finding them in the dark was not illusion. It was the brief emergence of a weaponized future glimpsed only once before vanishing back into the shadows of history. When Japan's Kwantung Army collapsed in Manchuria under the Soviet onslaught of August 1945, Allied forces uncovered evidence of atrocities so appalling that even the horrors of the Pacific War seemed eclipsed. The notorious Unit 731, officially the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, had operated for years in secrecy near Harbin, conducting biological warfare experiments on prisoners of war and civilians. The scale of its crimes is now partially acknowledged. Frostbite tests, plague bomb trials, vivisection without anesthesia. But the full archive of Unit 731's work, its data, specimens, and field reports, was never made public. Instead, evidence indicates it was seized, divided, and concealed in what intelligence officials came to call the Black Vault. Its contents would shape Cold War biological research while ensuring the truth of Japan's war crimes remained deliberately suppressed. The official narrative holds that Unit 731's records were destroyed by retreating Japanese forces in August 1945. General Shiro Ishii, its commanding officer, ordered laboratories burned and personnel sworn to silence. Yet fragments of OSS, Office of Strategic Services, cables suggest otherwise. One cable dated October 12, 1945, originating from Darien Harbor, reported interception of sealed crates, Mukden origin, contents unknown, presumed medical. These crates, shipped under Japanese military escort, never appear in Allied evidence chains. A second OSS report from Tientsin, marked most secret, referred to special materials recovered from Harbin biological type, awaiting transfer to Yokohama for further handling. After this, the trail vanishes from Allied files. What happened to these crates remains one of the most troubling mysteries of the war's aftermath. Testimony from Japanese personnel captured by the Soviets paints part of the picture. At the 1949 Khabarovsk war crimes trials, multiple former Unit 731 doctors described crates of documents, cultures, and preserved samples being removed by rail from Pingfang, Unit 731's headquarters, as Soviet troops advanced. One witness, Major Tomio Karasawa, insisted the crates were loaded not for destruction, but for handover to foreign authorities. Soviet prosecutors accused the United States of collusion, claiming that Washington granted immunity to Ishii and his staff in exchange for the results of their experiments. Though dismissed at the time as propaganda, later declassified US Army memoranda confirmed negotiations with Ishii. A memorandum dated May 6, 1947, addressed to General Douglas MacArthur, explicitly recommended immunity for Ishii in exchange for data on human susceptibility to pathogens of military interest. The recommendation was approved. What of the Soviet side? Declassified GRU reports from the early 1950s reveal that the Red Army seized biological warfare data from Japanese facilities in Manchuria. Some of this material was allegedly transferred to laboratories near Sverdlovsk. In 1992, after the Soviet collapse, Russian researcher Vladimir Orlov uncovered a 1952 memorandum describing extensive studies of plague vectors based on captured Japanese documentation. The document notes that certain volumes were incomplete, believed taken by Americans prior to our arrival. Thus, the Black Vault appears to have been divided, half falling into US hands, half into Soviet custody, ensuring that neither side had reason to expose the full extent of the crimes. For Washington and Moscow alike, scientific advantage outweighed justice. The human toll erased by this bargain is staggering. Surviving fragments of Unit 731's internal reports, preserved in the Chinese archives in Harbin, describe frostbite experiments on hundreds of prisoners, most of them Chinese civilians. Subjects were forced outdoors in sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze, then thawed under varying methods to record tissue necrosis. Other files detail cholera-laced bombs tested on villages in occupied Manchuria. Yet in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal of 1946-48, no charges were brought against Ishii or his senior staff. Their names simply did not appear on the indictments. Behind closed doors, American prosecutors argued that the scientific data was too valuable to be destroyed by trials. Hints of the Black Vault's survival surfaced again during the Korean War. In 1952, Chinese and North Korean officials accused the United States of deploying biological weapons, claims dismissed by Washington as communist propaganda. Yet an intercepted British Foreign Office cable from April 1953 noted, "Soviets citing captured Japanese experimental data in accusations. Possibility of truth cannot be dismissed." The same year, a RAND Corporation study commissioned by the US Air Force examined historical precedents of pathogen deployment, citing unpublished Japanese field trials, 1941 to 44, Manchuria. The study was classified until 1986. Its language strongly implied access to data unavailable from any public source. Even within US archives, the fate of Unit 731's records remains deliberately obscured. In 1981, a Freedom of Information Act request produced a heavily redacted document from the National Archives titled "Exploitation of Japanese BW Data." Entire pages were blacked out, though one surviving line read, "Original Harbin files, deposited at Camp Dietrich, 1947. Camp Dietrich, later Fort Detrick, was the center of America's biological warfare program. Its early breakthroughs in aerosolized anthrax and plague defense coincided eerily with the reported arrival of Ishii's sealed crates. The suppression extended beyond government secrecy. Survivors of Unit 731's atrocities, primarily Chinese, received no recognition or reparations. Requests for testimony at the Tokyo trials were ignored. When Japanese journalist Seiichi Morimura attempted to publish accounts of the unit in the 1980s, he was met with lawsuits and official denials. Even today, many Japanese school textbooks omit mention of Unit 731. The silence is not accidental. It reflects the lingering weight of Cold War bargains made in the ashes of 1945. The term Black Vault first appeared in a CIA memorandum from 1967, describing classified Japanese BW documentation retained for restricted research use. By then, Fort Detrick had amassed a library of foreign source material that included German chemical warfare research and, evidently, Japanese biological data. Soviet archives reportedly used the same phrase to describe their own collection of seized files, suggesting a parallel secrecy in both camps. Neither government had any incentive to release the material, since it would have exposed not only Japan's crimes, but their own complicity in covering them up. What precisely remains in the Black Vault is still unknown. The few documents released hint at chilling details: instructions for plague flea breeding, methods of mass cholera contamination, and statistical tables on survival times for prisoners exposed to anthrax spores. But most files remain classified or lost. Forensic evidence of the vault's existence rests in the silences, in the absence of trials, in the missing names of perpetrators, and in the quiet expansion of post-war biological programs in both superpowers. The story of Unit 731 is remembered as one of cruelty beyond comprehension, yet the story of the Black Vault is darker still, a reminder that nations entrusted with justice after the war chose instead to bury the truth for strategic advantage. The victims, nameless and unacknowledged, disappeared not only into the snowbound pits of Manchuria, but into filing cabinets in Washington and Moscow. In both East and West, their suffering was transmuted into data, their deaths into footnotes in classified reports. The world was told the records were destroyed. In reality, they were hidden, locked away in the Black Vault, where even now their pages remain sealed against the light. What remains are fragments, torn logbooks, coded transmissions, maps with roads that lead nowhere. They speak of a war behind the war, a struggle so veiled that its survivors were shadows themselves. Perhaps the greatest secret is not what was done, but why the silence has endured. And as the last witnesses fade, one truth lingers in the archives. Some doors were never meant to be opened, yet their echoes still haunt the corridors of power.